So our group, for our project for the end of the year, we chose the Dakota Access Pipeline. And as we move to the next slide to kind of explain what it is, basically it's a pipeline which runs from North Dakota to Illinois. It passes through South Dakota and Iowa along the way. It was first proposed, the project, in June of 2014, and ultimately 3 years later, in April 2017, it was completed. Now, the purpose of it, according to the builder, Energy Transfer Partners, it is used to move about 500,000 barrels of oil per day. And the Energy Transfer Partners also claim that it's really a cheaper way to move those barrels of oil. And actually, the builder went above and beyond to make sure that the pipeline itself was constructed well above what the federal code requires the pipelines to be. And there were thousands of temporary construction jobs that were used, although the permanent job numbers weren't even close to that. You can count on a couple hands how many permanent jobs were created. But anyway, even though the pipeline has been around for roughly 3 years now, the protests are rampant because it's a big deal to the Standing Rock tribes. So backstory is the area that's hotly contested about the pipeline is in southern North Dakota and around northern South Dakota. It's near the Standing Rock Indian tribes. They are concerned that the pipeline itself is affecting the water sources, the critical water sources, such as the Missouri River and Lake Oahe, and also just their historical, cultural, religious sites. They're really put at risk as well due to the pipeline and the water supplies, wildlife farming, etc. You can name a lot of different things that the tribes are worried about these days. The pipeline originally wasn't supposed to be routed near the Standing Rock tribes, but the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers determined that the pipeline being close to Bismarck, North Dakota, was a threat to its water supply. So the pipeline ended up getting routed away from Bismarck and actually toward the Standing Rock tribes. Now, this, according to the tribes, really didn't sit well. It, of course, didn't sit well with the tribes because they brought up the National Historic Preservation Act, and the area that the pipeline was going to be built now, that's really an historical and culturally significant site for the Standing Rock tribes. So there's just been a lot of battles in the public realm the past several years over the pipeline's construction. Ultimately, it's protest. So and of course those protests, sometimes they did turn violent in that period, and police were kind of brought in to kind of settle it down. But even after the pipeline is built, it's been over 3 years since been about 3 years since the pipeline has been constructed, and the protests are still around to this day. So in this paper, we're going to talk about different ways, mitigation solutions to kind of see how resolve this underground conflict of interest and really take into account the rights and perspectives of the Standing Rock tribes. So first we're going to look at the epidemiology, and then we'll go into other risk factors and health risk.
All right, so the Dakota Access Pipeline project began in 2015. It was halted several times by protesters and litigation that they were going through. It's been operational as of the summer of 2017, but there was a development in March of this year when a new environmental impact assessment for the pipeline was ordered by a federal judge. As far as the people involved, the Sioux people at Standing Rock are made up of 2 Native American nations. It includes the Dakota and Lakota nations. The reservation itself is home to a little over 8,500 people. The average age for these people is about 28.5 years. It's a relatively young population. They have a low per capita income. It's about 50% of the federal per capita income. They also have extremely high poverty rates. That's at about 42%, which is extremely high. The employment on the reservation is mostly based around agricultural endeavors, education services, government positions, and entertainment on the reservation. Go to the next slide. This is their flag, also their government seal on their website. And this is just an image of some members of the tribe protesting the pipeline construction. For the risk factors, we determine them by researching the ways that Native American people are treated unfairly in American society. This unfair treatment makes them more susceptible to be ignored or taken advantage of by legislators and big companies like this. From European settlement on, there have been a pattern of injustice for these people. One of these injustices is the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which made it legal to force indigenous people off their land so that it could be settled by Europeans. This act resulted in what is known as the Trail of Tears, in which 5 tribes were forced to move from their land and migrate to different, less desirable land. Another one of the injustices is the Indian Appropriations Act of 1851, which created the reservation system. It was passed in an attempt to keep Native Americans away from the more desirable lands that the Europeans wanted to settle and grow crops. The indigenous population resisted this change for obvious reasons, but eventually were forced to relocate onto the reservations anyway. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, which legalized the confiscation and redistribution of the same reservation lands that were made by the 1851 Act. It was used in an attempt to assimilate Native Americans into quote unquote American society and small farming communities. Several more acts were passed by Congress in later years that further restricted Native American access to their lands. They were flushed off the ancestral lands and pushed onto more undesirable ones. This stripped them of their ties to their culture, and they were pushed to the very edge of American society. These injustices continue today. For the most part, these injustices sit in the lack of representation in politics. Most political decisions made about Native American people do not involve Native American legislators. In upper-level government, historically, there have not been many, in the range of 12 to 20, I believe. Indigenous voters are also affected by voter suppression. Many states like North Dakota require identification with the physical address on it in order to vote, and many people on the reservations do not have this type of ID. Because of this, they are seen as a low resistance area because of the lack of voter turnout.
Okay, so now moving on into the part of the literature review having to do with the environmental justice kind of aspect of everything. One of the main resources that we used in building this paper was a law review by people named Burleson and Rogers in 2017. And I'm going to start with a quotation from that law review that says, quote, "Tribal peoples increasingly find themselves in frontline communities facing high stakes energy projects that jeopardize subsistence lives and livelihoods." One of the unique things about the Standing Rock tribes comes from their view of what water is in their culture and in their religion. So according to the Standing Rock Sioux tribes, water is the first medicine, and everything in Sioux culture is connected, especially in their environment. The land, the water, and the air are all critical to their cultural livelihoods and how they've lived their lives historically. And the biggest threat of the Dakota Access Pipeline in particular, as reflected in their protests and the subsequent lawsuits, is that the oil spills and the construction of the pipeline itself threaten the Missouri River directly adjacent to the reservation. It threatens their drinking water and their subsistence livelihood. The construction of the pipeline can create land degradation, as well as spills can cause not only damage to the environment through bioaccumulation and poisoning of wildlife and of biodiversity. The oil spills, especially on land, can also cause issues to your respiratory system and your liver. Benzene, which is a compound often found in the kind of oil that's being transported by the pipeline, is also known to be a cancer-causing agent. And bioaccumulation of oil up the food chain also presents a threat to humans in what they eat, and also just upper-level animals. But a next kind of piece that adds a different wrinkle of environmental injustice to this situation is that it's not just Dakota Access Pipeline that's threatening the livelihood of the Standing Rock tribes. You also have the Keystone and the Keystone XL pipelines that end up kind of framing the Standing Rock Reservation in a little bit of a triangle of different pipelines. And so they have lots of different land being threatened by these projects. And so far, there's been very little overall kind of resolution for their worries and their concerns. For example, so this picture is from 2018 when like 250,000 gallons of oil spilled in North Dakota from not the Dakota Access Pipeline, but the Keystone Pipeline. And it just kind of shows this pattern of, you know, these companies tend to make claims about what kind of safety measures they have implemented into their projects, but inevitably spills happen and they affect the environment and the people around them. As far as mitigation goes, there have been some efforts, especially in the last decade or so, to kind of prevent situations like this from happening. One of the kind of ideas that Burleson and Rogers cite in their paper is the idea of environmental human rights to participation and access to justice. And this is just kind of purporting the idea that all people, regardless of their race, their origin, their culture, have the right to be participating in local politics, especially that concern their local environment, and they should have access to justice when those environmental rights have been violated. And so that's what the lawsuits that the Standing Rock Reservation have filed have kind of centered around, that the Army Corps of Engineers failed to properly execute the environmental impact assessment that was required for the pipeline. And there has been a little bit of success in the courts. As we mentioned a little bit earlier in the paper, a federal judge recently required that the Army Corps of Engineers has to redo the environmental impact assessment more completely. One of the other main mechanisms that tribes often use to kind of push back against environmental injustice like this is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UN-DRIP, in 2007, which kind of establishes the right to self-determination or indigenous sovereignty, which we'll talk a little bit about in the next section. So this is just another picture of protesters of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and this is just the headline, one of the headlines discussing that ruling from the federal judge saying that the Army Corps of Engineers has to redo the environmental impact assessment.
Okay. Every day, irreversible damage is done to our natural ecosystems and to ourselves by allowing energy companies to implement pipelines, mines, and fracking on our planet. And in order to move forward and prevent another Dakota Access Pipeline, we should transition into an energy efficient, non-fossil fuel economy. We need the proper infrastructure to make the jump or to clear the path from fossil fuels to using sustainable energy. A good step in that direction is modernizing the electrical grid. The grids we have today do not support renewables, and this is because of the expense to upgrade these systems. As an example, Costa Rica has produced 95% of its electricity through renewable energy. Another big thing people can do is get involved with their local cities. A lot of power revolves around being involved in your local and state government. The reality of depending on companies that do not keep the people in mind but only profit is the certainty that they will come into your city, take away everything that makes it valuable, and then leaving the residents to take care of what's left of their community. Community involvement prevents things like that from happening. For example, we can look to Mauna Kea. Indigenous locals were able to prevent a local company from building a telescope on one of their sacred mountains. This was a very successful attempt in community involvement. We can innovate and provide ourselves with resources without destroying people's traditions and sacred earth around them. Indigenous communities have lived, died, and fought for this earth and the protection of its natural resources for generations. And moving forward, we cannot have environmental justice without Indigenous sovereignty.
So to conclude, the Dakota Access Pipeline and other energy projects reveal inequalities that have long historical roots, with the example of colonialism and the problems it had with indigenous people not being represented as much as they should, and pipelines being built in the area that they live in without them having much of a say in it. The pipeline poses multiple health risks that threaten traditions and culture, especially to the water sources of the area. The U.S. government's treatment of Standing Rock Tribe was clearly unjust and should be remedied. Fair community involvement and indigenous sovereignty are crucial to prevent further environmental injustices like the Dakota Access Pipeline and Keystone XL.